What if a single click could lock your life behind an unbreakable door? What if an email in your inbox looked and sounded exactly like your boss, and one transfer later, tens of millions were gone? What if the entire internet turned into a tidal wave, slamming into a target so hard that routers buckled and screens went dark? Tonight, we opened 3 case files of ransomware outbreak that taught the world about cryptography the hard way, a CEO fraud that swallowed a fortune in minutes, and a 300 gigabit siege that proved traffic can be a weapon. We're not here to scare you. We're here to decode what happened, how it happened, and which simple moves will keep you from becoming a footnote. Case 1, the red screen arrived without warning. In homes and offices, a normal day dissolved into panic as machines rebooted into a wall of text. The note was cold, clinical, and final. Your files are encrypted, pay within days, or lose them forever. The name that became legend was CryptoLocker, and behind it were 2 ingredients most people never see: phishing and math. It started with a well-crafted email that looked legitimate, maybe a shipping notice, maybe a scanned fax. The attachment wasn't a document, it was a booby trap. Open it and a program slid into place quietly, like a lockpick you never heard turning. That was the initial foothold, disguise and timing. From there, escalation. Once inside, CryptoLocker did not destroy your data, it did something worse. It made your files unreadable using strong encryption, a kind of puzzle only solvable with a key the attackers held. Encryption itself isn't evil, it's what protects your banking, your messaging, your secrets. But in this story, encryption was turned against you. The program looked for your photos, your projects, your spreadsheets, the moments and memories that were uniquely yours, and wrapped them in math so pure that even experts couldn't reverse it. No smoke, no sparks, just silence and a countdown. Then came the payload and the pitch, a ransom demand, typically a few $100s in Bitcoin, and a timer. Pay before the clock drains to 0, they said, and you'll get your key. Wait too long and the door slams shut forever? This wasn't a one-off. It rode on the back of a larger criminal ecosystem, spreading through a botnet, a swarm of infected computers silently controlled by an unseen operator. This botnet wasn't just for ransomware, it was also used to steal credentials and move money, like a digital pickpocket collective that also moonlighted as a safecracker. When the ransom machine spun up, it had reach. Hundreds of thousands of endpoints across offices and living rooms. It was a franchise model of pain. Impact turned out staggering. By some estimates, hundreds of thousands of machines were hit worldwide. The average ransom was designed to be just small enough to make you think it was easier to pay than to rebuild. Many did pay. Many lost everything anyway, either because they missed the deadline or were infected by copycats with no intention of helping. There were stories of family businesses forcing down the lights, of wedding photographers watching entire seasons of joy vanish, of hospitals racing to isolate systems. The persistence was ruthless and the math was sound. For a while, the attackers had monopoly power over your memories. But attackers weren't the only ones making moves. Law enforcement and private researchers followed the trail to the underlying botnet command systems. In a global operation, they disrupted the infrastructure that coordinated the infections, that severed the nerve cords connecting ransom notes to their masters. In the wake of the takedown, security firms and investigators managed to recover and share decryption keys for some victims. It was a rare sunrise, a chance for people who had paid or prayed to breathe again. The lesson, though, was etched deep. One click can trigger a silent sequence, fake email, hidden program, unbreakable lock, ransom note. There was no cinematic breach, just a well-packaged ask and a clever abuse of trust. Case 2, a sleek office, a quiet morning, and a simple email with the kind of urgency that short-circuits doubt. The message looked perfect, crafted with the tone, style, and authority of the top executive. It didn't ask for your password, it didn't need to. It asked for something more concrete, a swift transfer for a supposedly confidential acquisition, a tight deadline, and a warning to keep it quiet. This wasn't a teenager guessing your login, it was theater. It was the villain using your trust as a key. The play has a name that feels bland until you see its damage: business email compromise. But you might know it by its nickname, CEO fraud. The timeline was brutally simple. Initial foothold: the attackers studied their target press releases, social media, org charts, the rhythm of communication. Sometimes they penetrated an inbox through a reused password or a cleverly placed phishing link. Sometimes they never stepped inside at all and instead spoofed the sender, forging an email address that looked close enough to pass at a glance. That was the wedge. With a foot in the door, escalation was psychological. They invoked secrecy, legal pressure, and speed. The goal was to keep the victim from consulting a colleague. No time to think, no room for process. The payload was a wire, not a small one. A single transfer measured in millions, routed to an overseas account controlled by the criminals and then laundered through a maze of withdrawals. The impact in a now infamous case: a European aerospace supplier watched roughly 50 million euros vanish in a matter of hours. It wasn't a breach of their firewalls, it wasn't a 0 day. It was a story about humans, about a team trained to execute and move fast, meeting a request that felt like a direct order. Afterward came the fallout: investigations, leadership changes, court rulings about accountability. There was no joy here, no cinematic chase scene. Just a corporation treated like a marionette, and for a few frantic emails, the strings were enough. If you strip away the jargon, business email compromise is a confidence game scaled up by digital precision. The perpetrators bank on the fact that we're all busy, that emails look almost right, that the status of the sender carries more weight than the weirdness of the request. And they know money moves faster than questions. The initial foothold wasn't a technical marvel. It was empathy for how human processes bend under pressure. The escalation wasn't code, it was urgency and isolation. The payload wasn't a virus, it was a bank. The impact wasn't just a balance sheet, it was trust burned from the inside out. Here's the part I want you to hold on to. Every one of us can be the fail-safe in that chain. We don't need to memorize jargon, we need rituals. A second voice on a big decision, a callback to a known number, not the one in the suspicious email. A rule that money never moves on the basis of secrecy and speed. In the end, the villain's favorite weapon was the expectation that no one would dare slow the flow. If you're settling into this, and this kind of dark decoding helps you think clearer, subscribe and stay with me for the next case file. It costs nothing and it keeps this archive alive. Case 3. Now picture the internet as a set of roads and highways. Pages are houses, companies are office towers. Routers and switches are traffic lights and junctions. There isn't a single police force. There isn't even a single map. And yet it works most days, perfectly, because the traffic is honest. It asks politely for a page. It gets a page. It moves on. Then in the spring of 2013, a storm rolled in, and the traffic wasn't honest anymore. What hit was called a distributed denial of service, DDoS for short, but think of it as a crowd surge so dense that doors can't open. The target was an anti-spam organization, a group that helps keep inboxes clean. After a public feud, someone turned the dial on a flood. The initial foothold wasn't an infection on the target. It was the weaponization of the wider internet. The attackers used a trick called amplification, turning small requests into huge responses and pointing those responses at the victim. Here's how it worked in plain terms. Imagine shouting into an echo chamber that repeats your whisper 100 times, but sending the replies not back to you, but to an unsuspecting neighbor. The echo chambers were open domain name systems servers machines meant to help translate website names into numbers. When misused, they would return large answers to tiny questions, and those large answers were aimed at the victim's front door. Multiply that by thousands of servers and you have a hose that can break windows. Escalation was sheer volume. The flood measured in hundreds of gigabits per second, numbers that at the time were near the ceiling of what the internet had seen. Think of it as trying to drink from a fire hydrant that doubled and redoubled in pressure. Routers strained, links saturated, collateral damage rippled across networks that shared paths with the target. Mitigation teams stepped in, specialists who know how to reroute traffic and filter the noise. They acted like emergency engineers, building detours in real time. The fight wasn't about passwords or code. It was about physics. How much can you carry? How fast can you drop the waterline before everything short circuits? The payload, in this case, wasn't a piece of malware, it was pressure. The impact was almost theatrical, graph lines spiking into the red, latency swelling, services wobbling under the weight. For the organization at the center, it meant a prolonged attempt to stay online, to keep publishing, to keep functioning while the edges frayed. For the rest of us, it was a wake-up call. The internet isn't a fortress. It's a collection of agreements, and some of those agreements rely on everyone being considerate. Leave too many doors unlocked, and someone will use your hallway as a weapon. When the storm cleared, the lesson was crisp. You don't need to be a hardened operator to help. If you run a home router, updating it and avoiding open configurations matters. If you administer systems, closing unnecessary services and following best practices seals off those echo chambers. DDoS defense isn't about a silver bullet. It's about not being one more amplifier in an orchestra of noise. Now, step back with me and look at all three. Ransomware as extortion, powered by trust in an attachment and the cold logic of cryptography. CEO fraud as theater, powered by personas and urgency. DDoS as physics, powered by misused infrastructure and volume. Very different stories, anchored by the same quiet truth. The first move succeeded because someone trusted what they saw. A familiar email address, a screen that looked like a document, a server that answered a question to politely. In each case, initial foothold to escalation to payload to impact followed a rhythm humanity has known forever. Disguise, pressure, extraction, consequences. Let's give you 3 moves you can make, starting now, that work across these cases. First, turn on multi-factor authentication wherever you can. It means a stolen password or a guessed one isn't enough to get in, and it turns many phishing wins into dead ends. Second, treat money and password requests as high voltage. Verify them out of band with a phone call to a number you already trust, and use dual approvals so no single person can move big funds alone. Third, patch and prepare. Turn on automatic updates. Keep macros off by default unless absolutely necessary, and keep a 3-to-1 backup 3 copies of your important files onto different kinds of storage, with 1 copy offline and offsite. These aren't just policies, they're habits. They're the difference between an annoyance and an obituary. Cybercrime loves silence and speed. Silence because no one wants to admit they clicked. Speed because everything today feels urgent. Your defense, ironically, is a pause. 1 beat to ask, does this fit the pattern of our normal process? 1 call to a coworker to confirm. 1 evening to set up that backup drive and test that you can restore. You don't need to be an expert. You need to be the person in the room who says, convincingly, let's slow down, just enough to check. There's a final thread that ties these stories together. The attackers didn't create vulnerabilities out of thin air. They used what was already available, our trust in familiar visuals, our need for speed, and the free tools of an open network. In a way, that's good news. It means our countermeasures are not exotic. They are within reach, boring by design. It's the boring stuff that works. Updates, backups, verifications, and the calm to do them. We live in a world of red screens, rogue emails, and floods of traffic. Shapes in the dark, but clarity is possible. Learn the rhythm, spot the disguise, practice the ritual. When the next message arrives, when the next strange attachment lands, When the next request begs for speed and secrecy, you'll feel the hair rise on the back of your neck, and instead of moving, you'll pick up the phone, plug in the backup, or walk down the hall for that second signature. And in that small, defiant pause, an entire breach will evaporate before it begins. These case files are not prophecies, they are maps of mistakes and recoveries. The red screen taught us that encryption can be a cudgel, but also that preparation turns extortion into inconvenience. The fake CEO taught us that authority can be forged, but process makes fraud brittle. The 300 gigabit siege taught us that traffic can be a weapon, but collaboration can reroute the river. Remember the sequence: initial foothold, escalation, payload, impact. Break it anywhere and you break the story. That's what we're here to do, one habit at a time, before the lights dim.